and welcome back. And we, of course, have moved location, but still at Constitution Hill. And we've arrived at that moment that I've asked you not to miss this morning, because we have gathered for you a stellar cast of guests this morning, people who were there, they have seen it, they are with us, seeing the reality of modern-day South Africa. And of course, it speaks to our question this morning that we're asking you about. Talk to us about your democracy. This, of course, on the eve of South Africa celebrating 30 years of democracy. 27th of April, 1994. Where were you? You know, what are your memories of that day, or indeed the day before, like today? And let me just introduce our cast this morning. And I say our cast because, yeah, if they were actors, they would be right up there, vying for the honors in this particular movie that they would play in. So to my right, I have Dr. Tiens Elof, and he was the head of administration of the multi-party negotiations process. And then to his right, we have Judge Bernard Ngwepe, who's a retired judge president. Ms. Cheryl Carolus is a veteran activist in this country, and of course continues to work in the field of activism in South Africa. And we have to her right Mr. Jackie Soroke, who is a leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, and he was also one of the CODESA negotiators for the PAC. So there you have it. Dr. Elof, let me start with you. And I want to go back slightly further than 1994 to the delegation that went to Dakar in Senegal to meet with the ANC. So how did you come to be a part of that? And what was the objective of that particular moment as you were part of that, roped in by the late Dr. Frederick van Zyl Slabbert at the time? So talk to us about that.
Well, many things in my life happened either by chance or providence, so you can choose which one. I was at a function and a friend of mine was asked by Van Zyl that the Africans and the Afrikaners must talk. This was 86. And I then said, it sounds to me like a good idea. And the aim basically was, remember, the ANC itself wasn't sure that they should meet these Afrikaners. And government obviously didn't want us to meet with the ANC. But eventually we did meet in a 3-day conference in Dakar. And I think it was groundbreaking in the sense that it wasn't the first meeting between internal South Africans and the ANC, but it was the first time that a group of mostly Afrikaners met with them. And obviously people back home cried foul and lots of trouble and so on. But it was to break the ground, I think. And I remember saying, okay, these guys don't have horns, so perhaps we can talk to each other. And obviously Thabo Mbeki was the leader of that delegation, many others. And in that sense, that changed my life. I wouldn't be sitting here if I hadn't gone to Dakar. And I think it was the first time that South Africans looked each other in the eye and said, let's go forward to a common future.
But when your delegation came together, I'm curious to know, what were the conversations? What were you hoping to achieve beyond the meeting and breaking, the barriers? Surely you went in there with some agenda items to say, this is what we want, this is what we hope to come out with.
The conference was structured that the South African or the internal group gave a paper and the others gave a paper, and we had discussions. So obviously we wanted to talk about democracy and hear about what the ANC feels about that. We differed a lot about the economic system at that stage, even later on. I think on democracy we sort of could find ourselves or each other. On economics we were very far apart. But eventually it was understanding each other, and I think they also thought, okay, these Afrikaners are not all that difficult, perhaps we can talk to each other.
Cheryl Carolus, as someone who was here, and all of these developments are now suddenly unfolding after much strife in the country, what were your thoughts when you heard of this delegation making its way to Dakar, Senegal, to meet with the ANC?
We were deeply suspicious, and I think what we don't realize is what state our country was in at the time of 1986. We were a nation at war with itself. There were young white men who were forcibly conscripted into the defense force, who were in our streets. The enemy, as perceived by the then government, was the people of this country. The majority of the people, black, over 80% of the population, were now the enemy. And so the defense force was actually inside on every street in the townships of South Africa. We were really a deeply divided nation, but we were also a country that was alight. The place was burning. And to even contemplate that you sit down and talk with the enemy was just a stretch too far. But I think something else which Tian says, with the benefit of hindsight, we are all, 40 years older now from the 1980s, the time of that talk, almost 40 years older. You also realize that why it was so important to start those journeys was because there was an intractable situation in our country. When you think of what constitutes power in any country, there were aspects that we as the liberation movement, that myself, Jackie and others were part of, that we had, that the National Party government could never wrest to themselves. There were aspects of power that they had that we could never achieve. They had military might, they had significant control of the economy, but they also knew we could call a strike like that, and the people of this country would stay away. We played a vital role we had significant power through mass mobilization and organization on the ground. And the point where we all realized that we could either take this country down a route where we would destroy ourselves and everything, because there was no ways that the balance of power could shift. It was not a chance. I mean, Comrade Jackie and I both were in underground structures of the ANC, PAC, and our armed wings was never going to win military power over the National Party Defense Force. So something had to give. But I think I won't speak for Comrade Jackie, and it'd be interesting
and
to
I
ask
want to
him.
hear from him, from the PAC perspective, when this moment happened.
Yes, I think the nature of the struggle for South Africa, which is very complex and still is, was even then, because you see, we are not like other parts of Africa where you had the mother country, the colonial powerhouse, being in Britain and elsewhere. Here, we had communities, generations of people who live in the area and who have interacted with each other, but still have conflict in the way in which power is shared or power is looked at. The PAC knew very well that we could never really reach a Scotch-led policy to destroy everyone, and that at some stage we would be, like politics does, we'll be forced to sit at a table and negotiate a shared future with all the citizens of the country. That we understood. But obviously pushing for a status where the oppressed had a more powerful voice than the oppressed. That political moral high ground was very important for us to achieve. And I think to a great extent, the settler regime of the time was forced to go to the table as well, because the groundswell of support from the masses on the ground was too much. There was also the aspect of the international community. At the time, in the late 80s, the US in particular was sure that it was going to have a monopoly over power. It was going to be a unipolar world directed. They were talking of a new world order that they were directing, and they had interest in Southern Africa as a whole. However, the dominoes were falling. In Angola, the power of the US was being limited. The SADF was also losing some wars in Angola. Namibia had to be free because there was an international position, Resolution 435. I don't quite remember what it was, but it meant Namibia should go on. So the last remaining outpost of colonialism was South Africa. And resolving the issues of South Africa had also the implication of force from the international community. There was a Harare Declaration. We were in prison, and one of the conditions for these discussions was that political prisoners must be released. In the PAC, our principle of non-collaboration forced us not to entertain any agreement on indemnities and so forth. So we were released, and I'm also one of those, without signing anything. And our policy was that we don't need to appease anyone. We have to squarely go to the issues that confront us and put pressure, despite the reforms and the changes that were taking place, put pressure up to the ultimate end so that when we go to the table to negotiate, we negotiate from a position of strength. That's the approach we took.
Judge Ngwefe, at this point, what are your perspectives on the developments? Because you are already a lawyer at this point, and there's a lot of activity going on in the country, a lot of people being imprisoned, wrongly so, for standing up for their rights or trying to at this point. And all of these negotiations are happening. What's your perspective at that point?
Well, I must say, the process that was described by TNS earlier on, the meeting of the ANC and others and so forth, and the subsequent developments that followed, I must, quite frankly, I think to some of us, things developed pretty quickly, especially after, even towards the release of Mr. Mandela. I think things moved a bit quite fast, and even thereafter. Now, there I was. When we came here this morning, I jokingly said to Jackie that I told her that I told Ms. Carolus that I'm the person who sent Jackie to prison. This is because I was the advocate defending him when he was tried for his political activities and was sent to prison. I was his advocate, and incidentally, here I am with him now. Now, that was the role that was played by some of us at that time. We could see that things were developing. We could, and of course, all along, people were being arrested left, right, and center, and detained, and the like, and so forth, and so on. As the lawyers would run around trying to do the best that we could, which was against a very difficult situation. And there was a time, I'm just saying that there was a time when we were saying to ourselves as defending lawyers that we go there not to anticipate an acquittal, because during that time, nobody was ever to be acquitted. He wasn't acquitted as well. That's why I say I sent him to jail. Why I say I sent him to jail is because I knew, and probably inside himself knew, as many others, I knew that the odds were stacked against us, and he'll probably be found guilty. Why? Because you were defending a client who would never stand there in court and deny his political inclinations or deny that he was a freedom fighter. The principle was that they would stand there proudly in court and admit, in the sense of not denying the role they were playing towards liberating the nation. And you go there as a lawyer to go and defend them, knowing very well what to come out. And that is where we were. And I was thereafter, where I met Elof and others, I was one of the 8-member team of lawyers who were appointed by the negotiating forum. All the parties agreed that the 8 of us, we would be the lawyers who would come and help draft the new constitution. And I was amazed by the way people were apart, but also at the same time, how sometimes they could come together. And I could detect that by far the majority of the people were of course, willing to compromise here and there, but at the same time, you would realize that the division was there, and that division was going to remain for a long time to come. And as the 8-person team of technicians to draft the constitution. We'll do it bit by bit and present it over to the negotiation forum. And then they'll approve Article 1 and 2 and 3, and as I criticize it, we'll go back and we put in the corrections, then draft Section 1 from 6, 7, 8, give it to them, they debate. We're supposed to spend, so I think we're told that we'll finish within a month, but we spent 8 months there, precisely because the process was difficult and people were in many respects apart, as they were in some respects together. It was a very uncertain period in the sense that one could never tell what the ultimate outcome would be, bearing in mind that we all knew what was at stake.
Can I just add to that? Judge speaks about 8 months, but if you look at the time when the second phase started, it was almost to the day 9 months until the interim constitution was born. So I always think that's a nice symbolic one. And the other thing is that in the first CODESA, people often don't know that CODESA was in 1992. Actually, December 91 till June 92. And that one flopped. We went our own ways. And many reasons were there. But one of the reasons was that we didn't have technical people. The politicians, all of them, wanted to do it themselves. And they sat in groups of 80 in public with the media, and they negotiated. There was not a chance that we could reach it. And when the technical people came in, we started making progress. So it's lessons learned.
All right. We just quickly have to take a break, but we're going to come back because I want to pick up on that point, because CODESA 1, CODESA 2, as you said, I was actually reading through some of the transcripts yesterday and the day before, and it's just so fascinating reading some of the submissions that were made by the former Bantustan leaders, and how they tried to defend their position and the like. So we're going to come back and talk CODESA 1 and 2. And of course, I'll ask Jackie as well whether he has forgiven Judge Mwepe for what happened there. But let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and continue this discussion. And welcome back. And of course, just going down memory lane, reminiscing, and also just for some of us, a moment of education, because I think we haven't told the story of how we got to this point as South Africa, as well as perhaps we could and should be telling it. There's so much that we have forgotten about, and there's so much that we never knew, that we think we know, but we actually don't know. And it's always interesting when we go back into the annals of history and look at what happened and read, and you think, oh, I didn't know that, and perhaps we need to do better on that score. And this is what SABC is embarking on, of course, reminding us of who we are as a nation, how we got to this point. And yes, we have many issues to tackle at this point, but we should never forget that where we are, the rights that we have, the civil liberties that we enjoy, were hard fought for, and they were often paid for in blood. And that we should never forget. So thanks so much for being with us here on Morning Live. Dr. Tiens Elov, Judge Bernard Mwepe, Cheryl Carolus, and Jackie Siroke are our guests this morning. And we stopped at CODESA. We're now at CODESA. Moving on from where we started, we're at CODESA. Ms. Carolus, you wanted to come in at that point.
No, I was just going to say that at the end, if we think about it, it's quite remarkable, because with CODESA 1 and the whole CODESA process, everybody had the same and equal vote in that room. And we somehow managed to produce a constitution that, at the risk of sounding immodest, I would say is the best constitution in the world today. It's written in simple language. Thank you, Justice Mwepe. It is robust, and in many ways, it has been what has saved us against some of the wrongdoing in our country, or the liberation of some of those rights in it. But that 14 parties could sit down, nobody had more votes than the other one, and we found that constitution that enshrined our hopes and our aspirations and the framework for how we would conduct this very polarized country that was at war with itself, how we would move forward. And I think it's quite a remarkable achievement that we also mustn't forget that 14 parties, each one with one vote, not saying I represent 90%, I represent 40%, but we were able to find, with all these disparate views and conflicting things, what was it that was the vision and the dream that we all shared for the future.
And speaking of that vision and that dream that we share as South Africans, it's not a static one.
No.
And, you know, we look at many people today talking about our constitution and the need for amendment to that constitution. And I want to talk about that because people feel that there are certain things that are in the constitution. Someone actually said this week, someone sent a voice note where they were saying that, you know, if this constitution of ours is so wonderful, why then are we going through all the things that we are going through, one? And two, why has nobody copied this wonderful constitution of ours? That was what the voice note said. So how would you respond to that, Mr. Saroki?
I think we should, with reflection and with hindsight, also make critical reflections on the CODESA process itself and on the constitution of the country. Whilst it's lauded by many people as a wonderful constitution, and we agree. I mean, there's nothing that safeguards people's interest like to give them all the basic freedoms to talk, because we came from an era when voices were suppressed, when people were killed and jailed, and there was internecine violence around that time when these talks were taking place. However, the greatest issue with the CODESA process for me was that some of the decision-making processes were flawed. Look, you had 14 organizations, most of them government-related, including organizations that represented the Bantustan, the erstwhile Bantustan. And you had liberation movement, about 2 of them in that forum. So the CODESA 1 and 2 process had its own difficulties, which also led to the ANC walking out. Because some of the processes, I mean, the ANC was facing serious difficulties. You remember the violence was too high. But you had organizations like the Inkatha movement being infiltrated and abused by the SADF rogues, they call them, who were igniting fires and killing people while the negotiations were going through. The 2 points I want to raise is that they had a concept called sufficient consensus. That concept meant that even if you raise the right point, it would not be considered because the majority outvote you. In essence, that's what it meant. The second thing is, like all legal documents, people were able to smuggle in poison pills. Poison pills are sections of the law that make it difficult for you to implement those laws. And lawmakers who work like that without balancing issues in such a way that it must be practical for me to have regular water that the Constitution promises me. It must be practical for me to have food that everybody needs. It must be practical for these things to be implemented. All those things were not properly checked. And the poison pill also sabotaged the issue of land. Whilst we have property rights, the property rights defend those who have property without having acquired that property properly. So there's still issues that need to be debated and discussed from that constitution. And these are issues that are apparent and real today.
Sakina?
I see the revolutionary has not left, Jackie. On the sufficient consensus, just to say that the technical definition, because we had to write the minutes, was that enough parties must agree for the process to go on. In practice, when my colleague who wrote the minutes asked Cyril, what exactly is sufficient consensus? He said, if Roof and I agree, we have sufficient consensus. And I agree, but we also had a time frame. There was violence, We knew that we had to get to an election as soon as possible. So we had to have deadlock breaking mechanisms. And the first CODESA didn't have it. By the way, there's no such thing as CODESA 2. The name CODESA was a hugely political thing. We took 2 days to discuss it, and then we decided we'll have a generic name. We'll just call it the multi-party negotiating process. So that's CODESA 2, and that one worked better, but the time frame was short. So I agree with Jackie that not everything could be addressed. People often say to me, you were there, why didn't you give us a proper economic system? I said, we didn't have time, and it's not the place in a constitution to describe an economic system. That's a policy issue that the government, but those second, what they call second degree socioeconomic rights, food and so on, I think they have been there in principle, but they have to be rolled out by government, and that unfortunately didn't happen.
Sakina, I do want to say, however, the problem is not the constitution. The problem is the political will to implement.
Sure.
I would argue very strongly, Comrade Jackie, that the provisions around land rights, for example, and the young man who was an articled clerk here at the Constitution Court, well, I suppose he's also not so young anymore, Tembeka Nkatoebe, advocate also, asserts very strongly, and I agree with him. The land clauses as they stand in the Constitution, there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's the political will of the elected leaders who to actually implement it. A constitution cannot give you mechanisms for how you provide food. Our constitution is unique because it's the only one in the whole world that actually has socio-economic rights enshrined within it. And we have found that sections of that has been enforced and the jurisprudence has evolved as a consequence. You think, for example, the access to antiretrovirals. At the time, the political leadership were actually opposing antiretrovirals, life-saving medical thing. It was through civil society that people today have access. The high number of people with AIDS in South Africa, living with AIDS, is because in South Africa, because of access to antiretrovirals, people don't die of AIDS. People live with HIV. And the political leaders, if they had their way, it wouldn't have happened. But because of our constitution, I was part of the movement that mobilized and we won the right. You think of the Grootboom case, which was the watershed case around people's assertion to rights. Beautifully balanced thing to say, obviously, everybody's homeless today, is not going to have a home tomorrow. But the Constitution compelled government and prescribed the Constitutional Court through the Constitution, said you have to demonstrate what is the journey in the case of this. And Mrs. Grootboom asserted that right. And it's how the law and will evolve and how we will enforce government to come up with policies that speaks to the needs of people. And we see the Constitutional Court on a daily basis say to the elected leaders in Parliament, you are falling short. This policy of yours doesn't measure up, but it also doesn't make the law. The Constitution can't be the law, and the Constitutional Court can't. So they instruct Parliament to say, do your job. You are not measuring up. But the Constitution is a framework. It's not used enough. And the point you made, education and active citizenry. We need to get back on our bicycles, and Comrade Jackie and I were just saying earlier, we can't sit and relax here. We have to force these elected leaders of ours to get off their bums and do what the Constitution tells them to do.
Judge Mwepe?
I think I must come in on this issue of the Constitution, the goodness or otherwise of it. As the people who were helping with the drafting of the interim Constitution, from which the subsequent final Constitution largely borrowed, we always had the back of our mind that there are certain things which must be built into the Constitution to make sure that we have a stable country and a stable government that would run the country effectively in accordance with the law. Because remember, we knew that what we're doing was to come up with a dispensation in which it will be a constitutional state. In other words, where the Constitution was going to be the supreme law. We knew that, and we were working towards that. And as we're doing so, we're making sure to make sure that there were certain things which had to be put into the Constitution for it to be able to enable the nation to achieve its hopes and expectations. And a good constitution is the one which has got those built-in mechanisms which will, for example, prevent the government from abusing its powers, parliament, and so on and so forth. So we do have, in that sense, our constitution that we subsequently had is a good one. But in going into practice, a different thing altogether. And that's where the problem comes. You may put up very important institutions into the Constitution, build them into the Constitution of the country. But as I often raise this point, the difficulty is in the implementation and realization of that Constitution. You need to empower those institutions appropriately. You must capacitate them, give them the budget to do that. Let's take, for example, the courts. Let's take us, for example, the Human Rights Commission. No, I'm going back to the court. Let's take, for example, the court. The judiciary is there. It has been strengthened by the Constitution to pronounce on the ultimate law of the land. But the question is, who are you putting in there? What kind of people are you putting in there to enable that important institution to function properly? I give the court as an example, but there are other. You have got Chapter 9 institutions. You can have that. We can have 100 institutions in terms of the Constitution. That will not help you if you don't put the right people to serve in those constitutions. But one of my problems, of course, my concern is the judiciary.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But I think this is, of course, the perfect opening to launching Democracy 30 on SABC News, because these are the conversations that you can look forward to, South Africa, going back, reflecting on how we got to the point where we are today. And thank you so much. I said it, we had assembled an absolutely stellar panel here for you this morning. Dr. Tiens Elof, Judge Bernard Ngwepe, Ms. Cheryl Carolus, and of course, Mr. Jackie Eseroke. And thank you so much to all of you for coming through. Democracy 30 launching on Sunday evening at 8:30 p.m. on SABC News 404. You don't want to miss it. And it's going to be worth watching right after Elections 360. But right now, Leanne standing by in studio with your news at 8.